Good evening and welcome to GC Talks, a series of webinars sponsored by Goshen College Alumni Council, planned for the 2021 school year, featuring Goshen College alumni and friends. I am Todd Yoder, Vice President for Institutional Advancement here at Goshen College, and I will be hosting tonight's webinar, Where the People Go, Community, Generosity, and the Story of Everence. Mutual aid, stewardship, and generosity are deeply embedded in the Christian faith and have been found expressed among Anabaptist Mennonite groups in a wide variety of ways. 75 years ago, Mennonite mutual aid emerged to organize the principle of sharing within growing Mennonites and Anabaptist-related denominations. Initially, MMA provided short-term loans to post-World War II civilian public service workers. Since then, MMA, now Everence, has grown to become a $5 billion financial institution whose services include a credit union, a trust company, a charitable foundation, retirement plans, group health insurance plans, practice mutual funds, stewardship education programs, and expertise in financial planning. Yet it also remains an agency of Mennonite Church USA and serves over 30 additional Anabaptist and peace-related denominations. A book-length history of Everence, Where the People Go, was recently published by Herald Press and Menno Media, celebrating 75 years of financial services rooted in faith values. To our viewers, thank you for joining us tonight. If you are viewing this webinar by Zoom, you can ask a question at any time by using the Q&A feature. We'll get to those questions before the end of the evening. Joining me on the virtual stage tonight is author Dr. John D. Roth and Everence President and CEO, Ken Hochstetler. Welcome. John D. Roth, a 1981 graduate of Goshen College, is in his 35th year as Professor of History at GC, where he also serves as editor of the Mennonite Quarterly Review, director of the Mennonite Historical Library, and director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anabaptism. He is the author of many books related to Anabaptist and Mennonite history, including Where the People Go, Community, Generosity, and the Story of Everence, tonight's focus. He was also spotlighted earlier this year in the Purple Hair Challenge during Together Goshen Day. A good sport. Welcome, John, to GC Talks.
Thanks, Ken. It's great to be part of this evening event. Thanks, Todd. Excuse me. I'm looking at Ken.
Ken Hochstetler, a 1979 graduate of Bethany Christian High School in Goshen, Indiana, and a 1983 graduate of Goshen College, spent his early career years in Souderton, Pennsylvania, near where his wife, Sue Alderfer, also a GC grad, grew up. There, he earned his MBA at Lehigh University and built a successful career in banking and financial services. A Goshen boy at heart, he earned the 1973 Goshen News Carrier of the Year Award. Ken was drawn back to his hometown by Everence to become president and CEO in 2014. Ken currently serves on the board of directors for Goshen College and Oaklawn Psychiatric Center. An avid cyclist and a creative golfer, Sue and Ken spend as much time as possible with their adult children and twin grandsons. Congratulations, Ken, on the remarkable success of Everence, and thank you for being part of GC Talks.
Good evening. Thanks for hosting us tonight, Todd.
Well, we'll get right in. And the last will be first. So for Ken, we're going to start with you. Ken, you know, this year, Everence is celebrating its 75th anniversary. For viewers who may not know very much about Everence or its history, give us a little background on the work Everence does, its mission and vision, and what you are featuring in your 75th anniversary celebrations.
Well, there's a lot of ways to describe the Everence of today. Todd did it in the introduction in a functional way, as in banking and insurance and investments and charitable services, tied together with financial advice and planning. And that's what I call the what. And it's all very good. I mean, it is providing necessary financial functions for folks living in the 21st century. It is what it is now as an organization after evolving for 75 years. But which brings me to the why of Everence. And the answer for that begins with the for whom. John Roth does a very nice job in this book describing the historical setting. So I'll leave that for him to develop. But Everence was birthed by Mennonites and closely related church groups as they navigated a transition from a largely agrarian enclave kind of society where they practiced separateness from the world and took care of each other to an increasingly then going out into the world. And then back to the why. So Everence was and is for its members as they seek to care for each other. It uses several fraternal and mutual structures without the motive of profit for shareholders. It operates in the context of Anabaptist church communities, providing them with capable marketplace tools to further their missions in life. We see our work as a modern expression of mutual aid. These days, we describe it as stewardship and charitable and community. And you'll hear those words tonight. And of course, if you read the book. Regarding the anniversary, we had envisioned a year of events in various communities, celebrating with our members in person. And of course, much has changed. We did kick off a year of recognition on July 19th with a virtual program on the actual anniversary date of our incorporation. But at this point, holding in-person public events are in question. Fortunately, this book was always central to our observance. So we started a while back, but the book is an opportunity to relearn and retell the stories before they get away. And so we are delighted to have it. And so say thank you, John, for that.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate that answer. So, John, a question for you. Most of your work as a scholar is focused either on Anabaptism in the 16th and 17th century, or more recently on the global Anabaptist Mennonite Church. Yet 2 years ago, you agreed to write a history of Everence, a church-related financial services organization. Why did you say yes to that invitation?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It is true that most of my focus has been on another era, another time, but I think there are some strong connections. Part of what I find fascinating and significant about the Anabaptist movement is its commitment to translate the ideals and principles of the Christian faith into daily life. So a distinctive characteristic is Anabaptists don't just talk about love or grace or peace. They're not just interested in doctrines, but the question is always, how are these to be translated into everyday life, into human relationships? So the theological idea behind that is the incarnation. We look at Jesus not just as Savior, but as the one who brings together the idea of love into human relations. And in that sense, the principle of sharing, of mutual aid, which is so central to the early Anabaptist movement, is a great example of this effort to say, well, we don't just say that all that we have comes from God. We always ask, how do we make that real in daily life? And the Anabaptists did that in very different ways. So the Swiss Brethren had poor chests, they had deacons, they took care of the poor. But the Hutterites, for example, their neighbors, said, no, everyone should give up all private property. We should share everything. And that this is at the heart of the gospel. And this variation in how the particular expression of the principles of love or of sharing is at the heart of the beginnings of the Anabaptist movement, and it carries its way through in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, all the way up to the 20th century. So part of what interested me in this story was, how do Mennonites in our context today, in 21st century America, how are we trying to put these principles of love and generosity and stewardship, these ideals, into practice. And it seemed to me that Everence was a very interesting, originally Mennonite Mutual Aid, then Everence, was a really interesting expression of that effort. Not perfectly, always partially. So that was one central theme. The second, and I'll just say this quickly, is a tension throughout Anabaptist Mennonite history between an understanding of the church as face-to-face human relationships close up in the local congregation. And so mutual aid, in that sort of spontaneous, when a need arises, you respond, the barn burns down, the community shows up. We understand that and we celebrate it rightfully. But there are also expressions of the church that go beyond the local congregation. There are times when the church's witness needs to extend beyond just those face-to-face relationships. And so at the end of the 19th century, Mennonites began to ask, how could congregations collaborate with each other in organizational ways that would extend their witness to a broader world? So they started mission organizations, mission boards, for example, or publishing houses. They asked the same question about mutual aid. How can we together do more than we would if we were just acting out spontaneous face-to-face sharing within our congregation? And so what emerges is a church-related institution, which is a new thing. It hadn't existed before as an extension of the church. And I think we've struggled a little bit in the 20th century to understand how this form of the church, what place it has, to whom is it accountable? What kind of authority do institutions have? And so Everence is a great example to try to think through how the church bears witness to the world in institutional forms. And I really had a good time trying to untangle that question in the writing of the book.
Well, thanks, John. Back to you, Ken. I had favorite parts of the book too, but even though I'm sure you knew a lot of the history of Mennonite Mutual Aid and Everence before this history project started, what are some of the things about the organization that surprised you when you read Where the People Go? What new things did you learn about Everence?
Well, when I first started, since I hadn't worked here my whole life, my whole career, I knew some of the people. I did go around and track down as many people as I could to hear firsthand accounts. And I'd kind of done that myself. So as you say, Todd, I had gotten to know some of the stories. But then when we engaged John to actually do this, I knew he was going to come at it from a research, and he's going to want to talk to people, but he's also going to want to see what's the record. And so a surprise, for starters, was how much available material there was in the archives for John to work with. And maybe he could reflect on how, but he took a long time, and I appreciated that. It took a long time to kind of grapple with that. And he found a ton of stuff that, frankly, virtually nobody around these days knew that it was what all was there. And so he helped us identify that. But there were volumes of paper correspondence from the early days. John tells about the frequency of written correspondence that went back and forth between Ori Miller, as what we would today call board chair, who lived and worked in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Harold Schwartzentruber, who was the chief executive here in Goshen. Multiple runs to the post office each day to get the mail. And so not quite email or fax speed, but sure not Pony Express either. And then I suppose I was surprised about the level of conflict that has occurred and maybe endured. It's no secret that there's differences and opposing views among people, always have been, at national and global levels, including at the local level and within families, especially in political seasons, right? So one shouldn't be surprised about conflict in the church, and maybe it's church organizations. Some theological and, truthfully, I think personality based as well, even for those coming out of the peace church tradition. And that spills over into its church-based institutions. So perhaps especially for a pragmatic organization like Everence, where we deal with real and practical issues. So Everence was on the front of questions like whether Christians should purchase life insurance or use the courts to protect their interests. And I would also say that John helped us identify that there were conflicts within Everence on priorities and resourcing as it strove to determine what it needed to be when it grew up, as it developed. So I appreciated the way that John both bravely and sensitively identified issues and then helps provide the reader with context for understanding. And so there were learning for me in that process.
Thanks for that perspective, Ken. John, I'm intrigued by the title, Where the People Go. Could you give us a better sense of where the title came from and what is implied in it?
Sure. For that, I think we need a little bit of context. At the turn of the century, there were well-established Mennonite communities in Lancaster and Franconia and Virginia, and moving west in Ohio and Indiana. But further west, some of the Mennonite communities were younger, not as well established, and frankly poorer. And in the context of the Depression, there were significant issues with poverty in some Mennonite settings, and the old models of community support that you can just count on the community to take care of you in tough times didn't necessarily work as well, especially for older people. This was an issue throughout the United States in the Depression of the 1930s. Who's going to take care of seniors, for example? And Congress recognized this as a national issue. In 1935, in the spring of 1935, introduced legislation that was to become Social Security. And what we now more or less regard as an important part of our planning for the future. But in 1935, that was something new. And when Mennonites heard that the government was stepping in and was going to promise to take care of needy people with a government program, they became concerned. And so conferences, particularly out west, wrote to the general conference, to the center of the church, and said, we need to have a plan of our own. If the government's going to do it, we need to have a plan that is an alternative plan so that our people don't become dependent on the government. And that sparked a conversation about what would that look like? What would it look like for the church to take seriously the needs of the financial needs of its people, particularly the elderly? And out of that emerged a broader conversation about other kinds of financial care. Mennonites had various forms of fire insurance, local wind and storm insurance that were for local communities. But this issue seemed like it required a larger response. So they turned to the church and said, help us develop a church-wide response. And frankly, the committees that were formed just could not find a way to move that forward, despite the fact that there were a lot of efforts by some leading church statesmen, including people like Guy F. Hirschberger, a sociologist who was deeply concerned about these matters. So committees met, and finally the story is told in 1943. The Committee on Industrial Relations, of all things, a committee that was trying to sort through how Mennonites should respond to the emergence of unions, another financial related issue. The Committee on Industrial Relations met in the home of Ori Miller in Pennsylvania, and they said they were frustrated that the Committee on Stewardship that was supposed to move this question of mutual aid forward had not done anything. And they said, we've got to take this into hand. And the meeting, according to the oral tradition, the gathering met all morning. They took a break, took a nap, and after their nap, Ori Miller came out and he had a little pad and he had 3 points. And the 3 points were that the church is in need of a church-wide response to financial issues. The reality, our context has changed since the past. World War II was we're in the middle of World War II in 1943, and that we need new expressions, new forms to address a changing context. And finally, he said, the organization will be known as Mennonite Mutual Aid, and the church is changing, and this new organization will need to go wherever in good conscience it can, where the people go. This organization will need to follow the needs, the demands, the expectations of our people. And with that, where the people go, he introduced a really interesting and important dynamic that has been part of Mennonite Mutual Aid and Everence ever since. In the early years, it was clear that this was a church organization, that it was part of the church under the general board. It's all major decisions needed to be taken to the church. And yet at the same time, from the very beginning, the organization was asking, well, what are the actual needs of our people? What are the people saying? How can we respond to what the people's needs are? And those needs, not surprisingly, continued to change over time. And so what began as a short-term loan program for returned civilian public service workers who had given up 2, 3, 4 years of their life out of the workforce, now uncertain about what their futures were, Mennonite Mutual Aid said, well, we will respond with short-term loans to help you get set up in work. But very soon after that, a burial aid program emerged. Soon after that, a hospital and surgical, a kind of early form of health insurance emerged. A survivor's aid, they called it survivor's aid. It's really life insurance, but because life insurance was a bad word, survivor's aid, because that was what the interests were. 1952, Mennonite Foundation, an opportunity or a framework to help philanthropy, to help people organize their giving in a more structured way. Mennonite retirement. So as institutions are growing, there are needs that emerge. And it's been a hallmark of Everence from the very beginning that it's attentive to the will of its members. Still church related, but it makes a difference if you're an organization only looking up to the church, or if you're an organization that defines itself as a membership driven of, for, by the people. And I think where the people go is an appropriate descriptor for Everence throughout its history.
Thanks, John. Ken, these are challenging times for all church-related institutions, whether it's Everence, Goshen College, or any of a dozen other organizations. Not just because of COVID, but in a deeper sense of what it means to be a church-related institution in a rapidly changing context. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges our church-related institutions are facing, and how should we respond to them?
Well, Todd, I would like to respond like the presidential candidates did in recent debates. I want to go back and answer the question you just asked, John, and then I'll link it back to this one, I think. When we commissioned John to research and record the history, the story of Everest, I asked him to compose it as a forward-looking history, one that would inform those working at Everest now and those to come yet in the future. So I ran across the quote that led to the book title for the first time soon after I came to Everest. I learned that it had been used here off and on through the years. Now, as a student here at Goshen College, I knew the names of Miller and Kratz as the names of dormitories, but it wasn't until I moved to Eastern Pennsylvania that I learned the stories of Ori Miller and Clayton Kratz. So if you know the story, of course, they were sent together on the first relief trip to Russia, Ukraine on behalf of what became Mennonite Central Committee. Clayton Kratz was then a promising Goshen College student, didn't return. Ori did and became a prodigious institution builder, including Mennonite Mutual Aid. And the quote attributed to him captures well Everence's secret sauce. It's the original customer-centric statement, helping the church's members go where they need to go. It implies adaptation and meeting real needs over time. I'll offer it as one response to your question about how church-based institutions can respond to challenges they're facing. Is to listen to people and help them. So of course, the trick is wisdom on what to keep and what to change in that adaptation. A second layer of response to your question is my belief that we're dealing with identity questions. We are participants in an Anabaptist movement that was born from schism, and we've practiced it ever since. Here again, I'll offer Everett's example of spanning difference across and within denominations. From the earliest days, Everett's welcomed, MCs, GCs, MBs, BICs, and extended it to CMCs and LMCs. And I'm sorry for all the acronyms and all, but it was also the Amish and the Beachies and the Apostolics and the missionaries. And I think you get the point. Today at Everence, we're one of the few places where the M's come together with their historic Peace Church compatriots from the Brethren and Quaker traditions. And it has certainly been a strength and provided sustenance for Everence to serve broadly. But I'd propose that in doing so, by convening and resourcing the broader Anabaptist movement and beyond, it has provided a role in bringing and maybe keeping folks together in some things to enable a future day to bring us back closer together again, despite differences. So I'd offer a version of that as a path for faith-based institutions to meet the challenges that are coming at us.
Thanks, Ken. John, back to you. I have a question for you. At the heart of the MMA Everence identity is this concept of mutual aid or stewardship. How has this principle been sustained over the past 75 years, and how has it changed? Is mutual aid still relevant in the 21st century?
Well, you know, at the heart of it, it's really a very simple, deceptively simple principle. And it goes back to the biblical story in of Genesis chapter 1. We were created by a loving God to live in transparent, vulnerable, sharing relationships with God, with each other, and with creation. And of course, that's disrupted by sin. But when the question is put to Cain, am I my brother? When he says, am I my brother's keeper after the fall? The answer is yes, we are. You are your brother's keeper. We are our brothers and sisters' family. And the beauty of the gospel, and it's expressed in the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, is that the kind of posture that we have of gratitude to God, all that we have comes to us as a gift from God. We didn't deserve it. That's the basic concept of grace. It comes to you as a gift, and it's not yours. It's yours to extend, to share. And you share that not just with family. We kind of get it, families look out for each other, but we say, no, our church is our family, the family of God. So this principle of open-handed a posture of reaching out, of where there is need, you respond, is basic to the Christian tradition. But it takes on many different expressions. And some of these are spontaneous, but others are organized. And so in the history of Everence, I think there have been a couple of key moments where the expression of mutual aid took a twist or took a turn. One of those key moments came in the early 1960s, when the organization had a well-established burial aid and surgical and hospital program. There were probably 30,000 subscribers, which is a big proportion of the Mennonite population in those programs. And it was doing well. And the pressure was to create a life insurance program. And so the thought was, well, we will go to the regulators in Indianapolis, and we will simply add life insurance to what we've already been doing. And what they discovered in the early 1960s was that their hospital and surgical plan, which had been incorporated in Pennsylvania, had been operating for about 15 years, basically illegally in Indiana. It was not meeting the regulatory standards of what a company like that in Indiana should do. And when the authorities heard that they wanted to now add a life insurance program, they became very concerned and basically were ready to shut down the whole operation. And in the midst of that sort of legal quandary, MMA cast about, so how can we rework this? And the idea emerged to apply for status as a fraternal benefits association, which is a special legal status that a membership organization like the Knights of Columbus or the Masonic lodges are fraternal benefits associations. These are membership organizations that do provide special benefits for their members, because that was all part of why they were not meeting the insurance criteria, is because the hospital and surgical plan gave more to people who were needy and extended benefits beyond what the premiums, might have suggested. The regulator said, no, you have to treat everyone the same. Once you do that, you are outside the bounds of how the organization needs to operate. They also noted that they didn't have any reserves and that they were operating on a fairly precarious financial platform. But the bigger point is, through an extraordinary set of circumstances, MMA became one of the last organizations in the United States to receive this status as a fraternal benefit society or association. And that did a couple of things. It meant that they could move forward with their distinctive programs, that they could offer more benefits to people who were more needy. And one of the most significant aspects of this is that the taxes that ordinarily would have gone state and federal taxes for a business organization, for fraternal benefit societies, those taxes are set aside and the organization can use them for philanthropic purposes for their membership. So that became the origin of the sharing fund that has gone on to be a huge part of the capacity that Everence has to share out of the profits that it makes with congregations, individuals, causes that are needy. And I don't know what the figure is right now. Ken will know it offhand, but it's been more than $100 million has gone through this sharing fund in various forms. So there is an expression of mutual aid that no one would have anticipated in 1945 when Everence started, but it emerged and it has continued to be, this fraternal benefit status has continued to be an important part of Everence's identity ever since. There would be other things. They talk about the healthcare crisis of the 1980s and how in the midst of that crisis, the question really emerged, is the church ready to continue to support healthcare when a healthcare plan that does not impose restrictions on who can be part of it, that does not do underwriting, that does not exclude people with pre-existing conditions, which was the basic ideal of the MMA healthcare plan for many years. So if churches joined it, if a certain percentage of the church joined, you didn't have to qualify, which is extraordinary. I mean, very few health insurance plans do that. MMA did it, but in the 1980s, as healthcare costs skyrocketed, it became a problem. And the church began to say, we may not be ready to pay the premiums needed to support this. A moment of crisis. And MMA came through that by going all out appeal to the church, asking the church to say, really, we need your loyalty now. And also combining it with a very strong message of health, you're taking responsibility for your own health. So education, a physical attention to diet, to exercise, to stress management, being more proactive in conversations with your doctors, thinking about end of life questions. MMA was at the frontier of that movement. And I see that as an expression of mutual aid, born a little bit out of the crisis of healthcare, but moving into a more holistic view of what it means to be participants or co-responsible for each other in community. So those are just a couple of ways in which mutual aid has taken on different forms through the decades. And I'm sure there would be many more.
Thanks, John. I knew there was a reason we invited you here tonight. Thanks for that. It was a great answer. Also, for those that have joined us on Facebook Live, on live stream, as well as here on Zoom, this is Where the People Go, Community, Generosity, and the Story of Everence. And we are featuring the author, John D. Roth, and also Ken Hochstetler, CEO and President for Everence. Also, as a reminder, if you have a question on Zoom, you can submit that through the Q&A panel. So, Ken, wanted to move on to you here. We are a Goshen College. This is a Goshen College platform here, and I got to ask a Goshen College question. What did you learn at Goshen College that has sustained or shaped your work in the decades since you graduated in 1983? What would you look for in a GC graduate today who applies to join the team at Everence?
Well, Goshen College was clearly formative for me, and I was a product of denominational high school and then college, and my wife was as well. And then we chose to send our kids through the system. So we're delighted to do that. And I'm hoping we have we're growing a couple of others in the next generation yet to come. I have to say, I was immersed in it, and it took me time to actually figure out what I had. And some of that didn't come in even until later. But today I can articulate a few things that I've come to really appreciate. So let me name 3 characteristics that I believe in deeply. So number 1, a nurtured faith expression. Number 2, a liberal arts in a relevant context. And number 3, preparing lifelong learners. And I recognize that this isn't a new emphasis. I think the various strategic plans I've been a part of have used versions of that at Goshen College. Everence has hired numerous graduates from our church schools through the years, and I relate to many loyal, capable, long-time colleagues who value the opportunity to combine professionalism with their personal faith and values. I did some demographic studies when I arrived and saw that we had a significant, really, majority a baby boomer workforce that was going to be changing over naturally. So we have doubled down on our leadership development and succession planning. We've ramped up our internships to enhance the pipeline because there will be a lot of opportunity in the next decade and beyond at Everest. We're looking for a diverse set of grads seeking to put their faith to work. So lots of combinations of technical and people skills. So I would say, come join us and bring your aspiration, inspiration, and perspiration.
Thanks, Ken. I really enjoyed reading this book, and John and I have talked about the historical context and how much I enjoyed that as from the historical story and our country growing from the early 20th century. But what also excites me is that other part, the future. What is happening now? What is in store? And I might ask you, Ken, again, what is in store for the next 75 years? And tell us a little about new aspirational markets, like Everest's recent office opening in Kensington neighborhood in Philadelphia. How is Leonard Dow and the Everest team making an impact in North Philly?
I doubt anybody can reliably see 75 years out. There's no one currently at Everest that was in the room when it happened. I have wondered what the folks that formed what became Everest in those early decades would think if they could visit us now. So today we have a robust platform with clients and members in every state, and we've served customers remotely since our very beginnings, which put us in a great position in responding to the pandemic. You asked me about 75 years. I'm not sure we can see 2021 yet. But we will continue to put significant resources into our digital strategy. So we keeping it fresh and doing it well. So check out Everest.com. And we do have team members located in about 24 offices, many in places that sound like small college towns like Goshen, because that's where our church members have traditionally clustered. Of course, that is changing. Churches we serve are becoming more diverse in many ways. The growing edge of the church is more spread out, more urban, more ethnically diverse. So, as Todd said, we recently opened our first location with people on the ground in Philadelphia. And we're working to figure it out, what it means to be Everest in the city, to make a contribution to the lives of folks that have historically been underserved. We started by hiring a local team led by Leonard, the dynamic banker pastor who I'd worked with previously. They call us recovering bankers, by the way. But he's really started, he and the team there are working to form partnerships with other organizations that are already doing work there in those neighborhoods, and it helping us rethink our products and processes to be what we need to be in the city. There's an old question about when's the best time to plant a tree? The answer is 20 years ago. But what's the next best time? And the answer is today. So, really, I would have loved if Everest would have done this earlier, if we'd done it through the years. I know we had ideas and dreams and plans. We haven't been there yet, but we're getting started. And we will look forward to taking what we learned then to our other settings. Somebody else, though, will have to report on what that all looks like 75 years from now.
Thank you, Ken. Got a few other questions here that have come in. I would like to ask John this question that came in. What was the process like working on the book? Who was interviewed? Where did you get the research? What basement were you digging around? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was a daunting project in some ways, because I didn't know that much about Everest when I started. I knew about the rough outlines of the history, but I didn't grow up in the organization, and so I started from a certain place of ignorance, and I began by reading brochures, that the company that Everest itself produced, and tried to find sort of whatever secondary sources might be out there. And there were some. Theron Schlabach, my historian colleague at Goshen College, has written a very fine biography of Guy F. Hirschberger, a key figure in the 20th century, in the emergence of institutions in the 20th century church. And he has a nice chapter on MMA, the origins of MMA. So that was useful. But then I went to the archives, and it turns out that the archives of the Mennonite Church, now located in the church offices in Elkhart, has, I don't know, 50 boxes, 70 boxes. And we're talking, you know, the standard archival size boxes of file folders. And some of it is roughly indexed. I mean, there are some finding aids that break it down a little bit, but until you actually start reading folder by folder by folder, you don't really know what's there. And so I spent a lot of time just working through the archival material. I also read the newsletters that the organization published. For a while, there was an internal office newsletter that produced some interesting, you know, you only get one picture if you read quarterly reports and the graphs and figures, the numbers. It's really a whole lot harder to get behind that and say, well, what was it like to work in the mailroom in 1954? Or what kind of machines were they using? When was the first computer introduced, and how did that change the way people connected with each other? That's a little bit harder to get at. But I went to wherever the sources were, and then I spent a lot of time interviewing people. Everence has had some longtime loyal employees, people who basically given their lives to that organization, and they were eager to talk. And in the course of a year and a half, I interviewed, I think, at least 50 people and took detailed notes as they talked. And I didn't have to ask very many questions before they started to share. And then the painful, difficult thing was to ask how, out of all of these stories, all of this complex, I mean, Everence is a complex organization. It has a mutual aid side, it has a financial side. And for somebody who's not already familiar with the world of finances, that's a pretty steep learning curve for me. And also just trying to figure out, how do these organizations relate to each other? Frankly, there's some, the corporate lawyer, the Everence lawyer, I think is well paid to keep straight how all of the various internal corporations are related to each other. But that was fun. That was a delight then to try to ask, what's the story here? And overarching it all is the story of, how is Everence connected to the church? How is it connecting to the changing culture? How is it connecting to changing financial realities, the regulatory world? And so it's not just an internal story, it's also a story that is constantly engaging with these other significant variables that shape the direction of the organization. And I completed a manuscript in November that turned out to be about a third too long. And so it was painful, but it was a good exercise. So you write a long manuscript and then you say, what's crucial to the story? And we spent we had a deadline. And so I worked hard. I enlisted even my daughters, who are good editors, and we compressed that to what's probably a more readable book. But it was a complicated process, but a thoroughly enjoyable one, and one that I think ends up with a narrative that holds together and that is pointing towards a future, as Ken just said, that awaits to be told. It will be interesting to see how this story continues in another generation.
Thanks, John. You know, we're going to take a couple more questions, then we'll have a couple final comments before we close. Ken, question came in and wanted to ask you this. I understand that the banking side of Everence used to be a separate entity named Mennonite Financial Federal Credit Union. It's a long name. Can you tell us how and why those two organizations came together?
So it was 10 years ago this month that a 65-year-old entity and a 55-year-old entity came together to form a new household. I've often kind of said it that way because that's kind of how it's been. It's when people, at a later point in life that have had established lives of their own come together and they create something new and different. But boy, they sure have something that they each have brought to it. That's what the two entities brought. Two different sets of traditions and ways of operating together, but it just became more and more clear over time. And then it was when Larry Miller went from being the president of the credit union, then headquartered in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and became the CEO of Everence, or what was then Mennonite Mutual Aid, that helped things kind of come together. Everence had always, or I should say off and on, considered banking as an important part of everybody's wallet, that there's something in there that in terms of what it was would be more complete if it could come together. There had been lots of focus on retirement and increasingly for older adults. And what the credit union and the banking function brings to Everence is meeting the needs of younger families and individuals, plus organizations. So it really represents the future that we can participate, we can serve folks that are even younger and younger families, and then for their whole lives and careers even. And so together, we're better together. In fact, we often have used that phrase through the years that we're better together. In the process, when just like two individuals that come together to form a household, if they get married or whatever, they talk about changing names. Well, there's an exercise. Sometimes you put things together, sometimes you pick one or the other. In this particular case, there was a decision made that Everence that served broadly, served Mennonites significantly and others. And sometimes that was well taken. I remember meeting folks early on that asked questions about that because it was still kind of in a collective memory. But these days it has settled in this name that connotates reverence and everlasting, and it's sure better than MMA when you type it into the Google search bar because you no longer get mixed martial arts, things like that. So there was lots of reasons that came together for these two things to create this new household, this new stewardship household that serves Anabaptist and beyond under the name Everence. And it truly is better together. I'm really delighted in the way that has come together and the way that that it explains, if you will, when we're talking to folks.
Thanks, Ken. John, I have a question for you here. In the book, as I was reading, I was struck how many times Goshen College was intersected with then MMA and of course into Everence. And it was, we shared administrators and shoot, Goshen College even owned the first building that MMA operated in. Was that surprising to you, or was that some vague thing that you kind of knew and it really solidified? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, there were some surprises there. On the other hand, there was a sense that the church in the middle decades of the 20th century still functioned kind of with a pretty small group of key leaders who, a kind of a generation of mostly men who knew each other and who worked in similar circles. And in some ways, it enabled things to happen. It had some negatives to it too, probably. But the leaders at Goshen College, not surprisingly, were serving on boards of the early Everence organization, or the Mennonite Mutual Aid organization. So for example, the economist Carl Kreider, who taught for many years at Goshen College, was the dean at Goshen College. He in effect was the first actuary. He was the one who began to raise questions about the hospital and surgical plan and began to suggest that, we need to plan a little bit more for the eventualities that might show up that so he brought a certain expertise to the early organization. C.L. Graber, who was the business manager of Goshen College, served as the first office, well, in some ways, the first on-the-ground administrator of Mennonite Mutual Aid when it was in the college-owned house at 1202 South 8th Street. And there were many, many Goshen College students who went directly from graduation across the street. The first new building that Mennonite Mutual Aid had was at 110 Maryland Avenue, what is now the Goshen General Hospital parking lot. But they built a building there. And in the early records, we see lots of Goshen graduates getting their starts in their careers working at Mennonite Mutual Aid. And of course, with the emergence of Mennonite Foundation, some viewers or listeners will know the name Daniel Kaufman, who was part of Goshen College's advancement team in your position, Todd, many years ago. For a while, Everence hired him as the stewardship minister of the church, and he carried the gospel of stewardship to congregations, along with others, John Rudy and others. But Daniel Kaufman then came back and started a very significant endowment drive at Goshen College, most of which was then originally at least invested in Mennonite Foundation. So that relationship has been a close one, a cordial one. And now Ken, coming along, a Goshen graduate, serves on the Goshen board and is always looking for gifted Goshen students to pull in as interns. He already mentioned that. I think it's a long-standing, solid, and warm relationship that I trust will continue for a long time.
Todd, I'd love to jump in, and this really strikes a real chord for me. This connection between Goshen College and Everest. Those of you that know geography know that Goshen College is on the south side or south end of State Road 15 or Main Street in Goshen, and Everest is on the north side. But it wasn't always that way. As John just said, the very first two offices were actually in residences, homes on 8th Street. And the connection for me is that I was a Goshen kid. You already mentioned that in my pedigree. I'm proud of that. I grew up on College Avenue, and my paper route was on 8th and 9th Streets in Goshen. So my customers included folks like Mary Oyer and J.C. Wenger and John Smith. And so coming back, I could tell you. So when I read that the office was at 1202, I have a mental picture of that. And so for me, it was amazing homecoming to come here, to come back to my hometown, and then to work at Everest, and to then with this book and other ways to kind of realize the historical connections, not to mention the geography, the locale of being in Goshen. So that's pretty cool for me. I wear that on my sleeve.
Great, thanks, Ken. We just got a question in from the audience. Question is, what audience did you have in mind when writing the book? And maybe I might extrapolate that a little bit. Ken, what audience were you shooting for when you commissioned the book?
Well, New York Times bestseller list, of course. I jest because I asked John to create a forward-looking history book. Yes, of hopefully as broad of an interest as we can have it or make it, but very specifically, there had been an effort at the 50th anniversary And it was a book, it was a composium on mutual aid and stewardship and financial terms in this context. And there were a few chapters on the life, on the history. But I thought that if we didn't do it now, and somebody waited until 100 years, I was afraid that things would get lost. I mean, there's no one alive today who remembers the beginning of Everest, or maybe there's somebody alive, but there's nobody that works for Everest, certainly. And I thought it really important that we rediscover our own stories so we can tell each other, remind each other around the campfire. Well, we don't do campfires, but you get the point, to around the conference room tables about who we are and who we come from. Not that that would lodge us in place exactly as to where we is or where we are, but I'm convinced in order to figure out where you need to go, you need to know where you've come from. And candidly, to avoid repeating mistakes of the past, you have to know those stories. And there are stories that that John has captured very well. There's a lot of stories that there were learnings in there for people and hopefully the organization. And I view this book as a tool for that. So we have copies for all of our employees. And I imagine we'll have enough for the next little while. And after that, we'll have it digitally. And I've suggested, in fact, I've done this. I waved my dog-eared copy quite frequently in the last couple of months since the book has come out for our team, and try to draw out parts of it. And I will also just say there's a fair amount of stuff in here that relates to the board, that our current board is now better informed. John came and addressed the board and told them some of those old stories from the past and proposed some of the learnings that came out of it. And this will be a resource for board members into the future as well. So I'm just delighted to have this, and frankly to capture it for the people who are closest to it, and then to answer the question that was given. The additional part is, of course, anybody else that is generally interested in the life of the church, the life of the faith body, this Anabaptist movement that we're a part of, and the various streams. We're an agency of Mennonite Church USA and serve over 30 different denominations, and the stories of those are interwoven in here and are important. Certainly as we tell about the past, but as we look to the future.
Thanks, Ken. John, did you want to add to that? Or is there any other insight to the audience that you imagined while you were writing this?
Does he get 30 seconds rebuttal? Is that what's going on here?
That's what's happening. I mean, you took it and ran hard. So
No rebuttal. I mean, Everence has close to 400 employees, and they're scattered. They're not just in one place, and they're not all lifetime employees, and they're not all from Anabaptist or Mennonite background. And so I think part of the challenge is, how do you communicate the ethos, the spirit of an organization in a way that could help somebody who is committed to their job but doesn't know the history, the context, the culture. Maybe this book will orient them a little bit and make it somewhat easier to and enable them to envision their place in the story as the organization moves forward. I also am a historian, and the book has footnotes. It was very clear early on that Everence could have done a nice coffee table book that would have been a nice promotional that had, the sort of thing that a lot of organizations do. But to his credit, Ken said, basically, I'm turning you loose, and I want you to tell me what you find. And I deeply appreciate the intellectual freedom I had to tell the story as I found it. And I hope that will be of interest to a wide range of people, even if you don't have a connection to Everence.
thanks, John. Hey, we're getting close to our time, and I have one last question before your final comments, or at least your opportunity for final comments. Goshen College just celebrated our 125th anniversary, the Quasquicentennial. 75 years. So what are you calling it, Ken? Is it the Diamond Jubilee or is it the sesquicentennial?
You know, I tried semi-sesquicentennial. It landed like a thud around here. So you know, I counted. Or there like 6, 7? It was too many syllables. So no, it did not catch hold. So we're going with 75 years, and yeah, maybe it's because we're numbers people or something. We're kind of locked into the precision of that. So yeah.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Ken. I'm going to open it up for a final comment. John, would you like to, you have a moment for a final comment here?
Well, I've been at Goshen for 35 years, and I've seen how organizations necessarily evolve, change over time as they respond to changing contexts, changing demographies, changing constituents. The church changes, and organizations necessarily are constantly in a process of not reinventing themselves, but being attentive and responding. And I find that in my own organization to be moments both of anxiety, you know, we're letting go of the familiar, and I see that in Everence. There's a Mennonite mutual aid is a great anchor, and it's the same time, part of the strength, the enduring resilience of organizations is their capacity to look forward and to change and to adapt. And I think that transition from MMA to Mennonite Mutual Aid to Everence, the addition of the credit union, I hope that my own organizations, that all our church-related institutions can find the creative energy to stay faithful to the deepest parts of our tradition, hold on to the ideals, but recognize that the ideals are always going to be expressed in new and different ways as the context changes. And that's a lesson I've learned, an inspiration really I've taken from working with this history of Everence.
Thanks, John. You're an expert storyteller. I really enjoyed what you've brought to this project. Ken, final comments.
I just really want to voice appreciation to John for his help in telling the story. You know, I had an old pastor once who used to say that if he had more time, he could have preached a shorter sermon. And what John did here is he distilled 75 years, 3/4 of a century, effectively into a couple of hundred of pages. I know he could have gone longer. In fact, he had there was stuff on the cutting room floor. But I really appreciate the efforts and what he produced, and I have great hope for what this will help us with going forward. I also want to appreciate a long list of people of Everest who cared enough, as John said, to speak into the preparation for this book, including the leadership team that I get to work with now. And I'd like to give a special shout out to the CEO predecessors who I've had the opportunity to meet. Jim Kratz, who has since passed, but I had a chance to meet him, Howard Brenneman, Steve Garboden, who served as an interim, and then most recently, Larry Miller. I want to thank them for their leadership in building the foundation for Everence to what it is today, and really for their personal generosity to me as I got started here, and I joined this next generation of their work. So, and maybe just finally, I want to say thanks to Todd and to Dan Lichty and Goshen College for providing this forum. Very much appreciate the shared histories of our organizations and people, and the opportunity to tell those tonight. So thank you.
Thanks, Ken. We appreciate it. This is why we created this, to share these types of stories. Well, thanks to both of our guests this evening for an enjoyable hour of the history and a touch of the future of mutual aid rooted in faith. Again, the book is Where the People Go, Community, Generosity, and the Story of Everence, authored by John D. Roth, and is available at all fine booksellers, including online at Amazon. Just search for Everence. And to you, our audience, thank you for joining GC Talks. And we invite you to check out programming throughout the school year. For future presentations and archived webinars at www.goshen.edu/GC Talks. So from the garden level of Goshen College's administration building, this is Todd Yoder. Stay connected, be well, and good night.